Hi, I'm Kaelen Stravick, the man who married into the Velrowe family only to be treated like absolute scum for 7 years by my wife's brothers. They called me the charity case, excluded me from family dinners, and openly mocked me at their pharmaceutical company in downtown Portland. Blake and Trevor Velrowe made it crystal clear I didn't belong in their world of wealth and power. But when their father's will was read last Tuesday, everything changed in an instant. As I sat in that mahogany-paneled law office, listening to the attorney's words, I watched their faces transform from smug superiority to absolute horror. Because buried in that 30-page document was one clause that shifted the entire balance of power. What did it say? Let's just say, the two men who spent years calling me worthless suddenly realized they'd been working for me all along. And the look in their eyes when they understood what I now controlled? Priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of disinfectant and polished marble always hit me the moment I walked through the glass doors of Velrowe Pharmaceuticals on Burnside Street. 7 years of marriage to Kaelen Velrowe, and I still felt like an intruder every time I entered the building her family had built from nothing. My morning routine never changed. Coffee from the lobby cart, elevator to the 3rd floor, and a walk past the executive offices where Blake and Trevor held court like kings surveying their domain. As the company's IT coordinator, I kept their systems running, fixed their computers, and made sure their precious data stayed secure. It was honest work, but in their eyes, it made me nothing more than hired help who happened to sleep in their sister's bed. Blake Velrowe, the older brother at 38, ran operations with the precision of a Swiss watch and the warmth of an Arctic wind. He wore $1,000 suits and spoke in clipped, efficient sentences that made every conversation feel like a business transaction. Trevor, 2 years younger, handled sales and marketing with the kind of charm that could sell poison as medicine. Both men had inherited their father's sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, along with his talent for making people feel small without saying a single cruel word. That particular Tuesday morning started like any other. I was troubleshooting a network issue in the research department when I heard Blake's voice echoing down the hallway. Someone needs to tell the IT guy that the server room isn't his personal office. I walked past there yesterday and saw him eating lunch in there like some kind of cave dweller. Trevor's laugh followed. Come on, Blake, be fair. Caves have better lighting. I stood there, hidden behind a rack of servers, listening to them discuss me like I was a piece of furniture that had been placed in the wrong room. This wasn't new. 7 years of marriage to their sister had given me a front-row seat to their particular brand of casual cruelty. They never said anything directly to my face that couldn't be dismissed as brotherly teasing, but the message was always clear. I didn't belong. The Velrowe family dinners were the worst. Every month, Karina would insist we attend these elaborate affairs at the family estate in the West Hills. The house itself was a monument to pharmaceutical success, complete with a wine cellar worth more than most people's homes and artwork that belonged in museums. I would sit at that mahogany dining table, surrounded by conversations about board meetings, market projections, and business strategies that I was never expected to contribute to. Kaelen's been working so hard lately, Karina would say, trying to include me. He completely rebuilt our entire security infrastructure last month. Blake would nod politely. That's nice, dear. Pass the salt. Trevor would chime in with something like, it's good to have reliable support staff in the family. Support staff. Never management, never leadership, never an equal. The subtle dismissals had become so routine that I barely noticed them anymore. When they discussed expanding into new markets, I wasn't consulted. When they planned company events, I found out about them from email announcements, like any other employee. When they made decisions about the future of the company that employed nearly 300 people, they did it in closed-door meetings that I was never invited to attend. But the strangest part wasn't their treatment of me. It was their relationship with their father, Winston Velrowe. The man who had built this empire from a single pharmacy in Northeast Portland treated me with more respect in 5 minutes than his sons had shown me in 7 years. Winston would ask about my work, remember details about projects I was handling, and actually listen when I explained technical challenges the company was facing. You know, he told me once during a family barbecue, pulling me aside while his sons argued about quarterly projections, this company needs people who understand how to build systems that last. Too many folks these days are focused on quick fixes and flashy solutions. You think about the foundation first. That's rare. I had appreciated the compliment, but I assumed it was just an old man being kind to his daughter's husband. Winston had always been gracious to me, even when his sons weren't. He would call me directly when he had computer problems, bypassing Blake and Trevor entirely. Sometimes we would end up talking for an hour about everything from network security to his memories of building the company. Those conversations felt like glimpses into a different world, one where my opinions mattered and my contributions were valued. But they ended the moment Blake or Trevor entered the room, and I would watch Winston's demeanor shift back to the distant patriarch who let his sons run the day-to-day operations. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had married into a family business, but I remained forever on the outside looking in. Corinna loved me, but she had grown up in this world of boardrooms and bottom lines, and she didn't seem to understand how isolating it could be to live in the shadow of her brother's success. When I tried to talk to her about it, she would suggest I was being too sensitive or taking their jokes too seriously. "They don't mean anything by it," she would say. "That's just how they are with everyone." But I knew that wasn't true. I had watched them interact with other employees, with business partners, with people they considered important. The casual dismissiveness was reserved specifically for me, the outsider, who had married into their circle but would never truly belong. As I finished fixing the network issue that morning, I had no idea that everything was about to change. I had no clue that the phone call coming in 3 hours would shatter the careful hierarchy that had defined my life for the past 7 years. I was just another Tuesday morning in my carefully constructed routine of quiet competence and professional invisibility. If someone had told me that by the end of the week I would be sitting behind Winston's old desk, making decisions about the future of Velrowe Pharmaceuticals while Blake and Trevor waited outside my office like supplicants, I would have assumed they were describing someone else's life. But that's exactly what was about to happen. The call came at 11:47 a.m. while I was updating firewall protocols on the main server. Corinna's voice was barely above a whisper, broken by sobs I could hear through the phone speaker. "Kaelen, you need to come home. Dad's gone." I dropped everything and drove to the estate in the West Hills, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as Portland's skyline blurred past. Winston Velrowe had been fighting heart problems for months, but he'd seemed stable, even optimistic during our last conversation just 3 days earlier. We'd spent an hour discussing the company's plans for expanding into biotechnology research, and he'd been excited about the possibilities. By the time I arrived, the house was already filling with people. Blake and Trevor stood in the living room, both wearing dark suits as if they'd been prepared for this moment. Family friends, business associates, and company executives moved through the rooms in hushed conversations. Corinna fell into my arms the moment I walked through the door, her designer dress wrinkled and her carefully styled hair disheveled. "The funeral home has already been contacted," Blake announced to the gathered crowd, his voice steady and businesslike. "Services will be Thursday at St. Mary's Cathedral. We'll need to coordinate with the company's PR department about the announcement." Even in grief, he was managing the situation like a corporate crisis. Trevor nodded along, already on his phone with what sounded like reporters and business journalists. I held Corinna as she cried, watching her brothers transform their father's death into a series of logistical challenges to be solved efficiently. The next 2 days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, flower deliveries, and endless streams of visitors paying their respects. Blake and Trevor handled everything with military precision, coordinating with caterers, arranging for parking, and managing the media attention that came with losing one of Portland's most prominent business leaders. I stayed in the background, supporting Corinna and helping where I could, but always aware that I was auxiliary to the main event. Winston's funeral filled St. Mary's Cathedral to capacity. The governor spoke, along with 2 congressmen and the mayor. Blake delivered a eulogy that had people in tears, talking about his father's vision, his dedication to improving healthcare, and his commitment to family values. The Portland Business Journal called it the end of an era and ran a full-page obituary detailing Winston's rise from pharmacy owner to pharmaceutical mogul. Through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Winston had always been a man who planned for every contingency, who thought 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. It seemed impossible that he would leave the future of his empire to chance or assume that his carefully built company would automatically continue running smoothly without his guidance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The answer came the following Monday morning with a phone call from Harold Fitzgerald, Winston's attorney, for over 30 years. His voice was formal, almost ceremonial, as he requested that the entire family attend a reading of the will that afternoon. Mr. Velrowe left very specific instructions about how this should be handled, Fitzgerald explained. Everyone named in the document needs to be present, including you, Mr. Stravick. Blake's reaction was immediate and dismissive. I'm sure that's just a formality, Harold. Kaelen doesn't need to be there for the family business discussions. Actually, Fitzgerald replied, his tone leaving no room for argument, Mr. Velrowe was very specific about Mr. Stravick's presence being required. The will cannot be read without all named parties in attendance. I could see Blake's jaw tighten as he ended the call. Trevor looked equally annoyed, clearly viewing my inclusion as another unnecessary complication in what should have been a straightforward transfer of power from father to sons. This is ridiculous, Trevor muttered as we prepared to leave for Fitzgerald's office. Dad probably just left you some token amount to be polite. The whole family has to sit through this because of legal technicalities. Corinna squeezed my hand as we walked into the building on Southwest Yamhill Street. Don't let them get to you, she whispered. Dad cared about you. He always said so. Fitzgerald's office was exactly what you would expect from a lawyer who had spent 3 decades managing the affairs of Portland's business elite. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound law books, and framed photographs of Fitzgerald with various governors, mayors, and business leaders. The conference table was large enough to seat 12, though only 5 of us were present: Blake, Trevor, Corinna, myself, and Fitzgerald. The attorney opened a leather portfolio and removed a thick document bound in blue covers. His voice took on the formal tone of someone who had performed this ritual countless times over the decades. This is the last will and testament of Winston Charles Velrowe, executed 6 months ago and witnessed by 2 members of my staff. He paused, looking around the table. Mr. Velrowe left very specific instructions about how this reading should proceed. I am to read the document in its entirety, without interruption, before answering any questions. Blake leaned back in his chair, confident and relaxed. Trevor checked his phone, clearly expecting this to be a brief formality before they could get back to running the company. Corinna held my hand under the table, and I could feel her wedding ring pressing against my palm. Fitzgerald began reading, starting with the standard legal language about sound mind and body, revocation of previous wills, and appointment of executors. The first several pages covered personal items, charitable donations, and gifts to longtime employees. Winston had been generous but predictable, leaving substantial sums to the hospital foundation, the university medical school, and various other causes he had supported during his lifetime. Then Fitzgerald reached the section about the family estate. The West Hills house, along with its contents and surrounding property, was left equally to Blake, Trevor, and Corinna. No surprises there. Winston had always talked about keeping the family home in the family. But as Fitzgerald continued reading, something strange began to emerge. The business interests were more complicated than anyone had expected. Winston had apparently restructured several key holdings in the months before his death, creating a complex web of trusts and subsidiary companies that would take lawyers weeks to fully unravel. As for Velrowe Pharmaceuticals, Fitzgerald continued, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, Mr. Velrowe left very specific instructions. Blake sat up straighter. Trevor put away his phone. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the formal transfer of power that would make them the undisputed leaders of their father's empire. Fitzgerald cleared his throat and began reading from what appeared to be a separately attached document, sealed and initialed by Winston himself. That's when everything changed. To my sons Blake and Trevor, Fitzgerald read, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, you have both worked diligently in the family business for many years. However, I have observed troubling patterns in your leadership approach that concern me deeply regarding the future of this company. Blake's confident posture stiffened. Trevor's casual demeanor evaporated as he leaned forward, suddenly paying complete attention. Fitzgerald continued reading Winston's words. I have watched you treat employees as expendable resources rather than valuable human beings. I have seen you dismiss ideas based on their source rather than their merit. Most troubling, I have witnessed your consistent disrespect toward Kaelen Stravick, a man whose technical expertise and ethical judgment have proven invaluable to this company's success. My heart started pounding. Corinna's grip on my hand tightened. Blake and Trevor exchanged glances that could have cut glass. Therefore, the attorney continued, while I leave you both substantial personal inheritances and continued employment within the company, I hereby transfer controlling interest in Velrowe Pharmaceuticals to my son-in-law Kaelen Stravick, effective immediately upon my death. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Blake's face went completely white, then flushed red, with what looked like rage barely held in check. Trevor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That can't be right," Blake said, his voice barely controlled. "Dad wouldn't do that. Read it again." Fitzgerald's expression remained professionally neutral. "The language is quite clear, Mr. Velrowe. Your father has transferred 51% ownership of Velrowe Pharmaceuticals to Mr. Stravick, along with voting control of the board of directors and final authority over all major business decisions." Trevor exploded. "This is insane. Kaelen's a computer technician. He doesn't know the first thing about running a pharmaceutical company." "Actually," I said quietly, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, "I know more than you think." The truth was, I had been paying attention for 7 years. Every casual conversation with Winston about market trends, every technical briefing about production systems, every financial report I'd helped digitize had taught me something about how the business operated. While Blake and Trevor saw me as invisible support staff, I had been absorbing information about every aspect of the company's operations. "Dad was losing his mind," Blake said, standing up so abruptly that his chair rolled backward. "This will never hold up in court. No judge is going to honor a document that hands over a $100 million company to someone with no business experience." Fitzgerald opened a separate folder. Your father anticipated that reaction. He included a detailed memorandum explaining his decision, along with documentation of Mr. Stravick's contributions to the company over the past 7 years. There are also provisions for anyone who contests the will. "What provisions?" Trevor demanded. "Any family member who challenges this will in court forfeits their entire inheritance and their employment with the company. Your father was very specific about that." The room fell silent again. Blake sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him as he realized the impossible position Winston had created. Challenge the will and lose everything, or accept it and work under the authority of the man they had spent years treating like a servant. Corinna finally spoke. "Dad really did this? He really left the company to Kaelen?" "He did indeed," Fitzgerald confirmed, along with a private letter addressed specifically to Mr. Stravick. He handed me an envelope with my name written in Winston's careful handwriting. My hands were shaking as I opened it and began reading the letter silently. "Kaelen, by the time you read this, you will understand why I made this decision. You have shown me qualities that my sons, despite their many talents, have never possessed. Humility, respect for others, and the ability to see beyond your own ambition. This company was built on the principle of helping people live better lives. I trust you to remember that purpose when others forget it. The next few weeks will be difficult, but remember that leadership is not about commanding respect. It is about earning it through your actions. Be better than those who came before you." I folded the letter and looked up to find everyone staring at me. Blake and Trevor's expressions were a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been fear. They were beginning to understand that their entire world had just shifted beneath their feet. "I need time to process this," I said, standing up carefully. "Harold, can we schedule a meeting for later this week to discuss the transition details?" The attorney nodded. "Of course. There are quite a few legal and financial matters to address." As we left the office, Blake grabbed my arm in the hallway. "Don't think this changes anything," he hissed. "You might own the company on paper, but you don't know how to run it. You'll be begging us for help within a month." Trevor nodded agreement. "Dad made a mistake. A big one. When you crash and burn, don't expect us to clean up the mess." I looked at both of them calmly. "I appreciate your confidence in me," I said, then turned and walked away. But as I drove home that evening, their words echoed in my mind. They weren't entirely wrong. I did own the company now, but I had never run a business of this size and complexity. I had never managed hundreds of employees or navigated the regulatory requirements of the pharmaceutical industry. I had never dealt with investors, distributors, or the dozens of other stakeholders who kept Velrowe Pharmaceuticals running. What I did have, however, was 7 years of careful observation and a deep understanding of how the company actually functioned. I knew which managers were competent and which were just politically connected, I knew where the real inefficiencies were hidden in the budget. I knew which research projects had genuine potential and which were being pursued for ego rather than scientific merit. Most importantly, I knew that Winston hadn't made this decision lightly. He had seen something in me that even I wasn't sure I possessed, and he had bet the future of his life's work on that judgment. The question now was whether I could prove him right, or whether Blake and Trevor would get the satisfaction of watching me fail spectacularly while destroying everything Winston had built. I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what my first move should be. By morning, I had made my decision. It was time to find out exactly what I was capable of. The first thing I did was call in sick to work, not because I was ill, but because I needed time to understand exactly what I had inherited before Blake and Trevor had a chance to undermine me. I drove to Winston's house, my house now technically, since Corinna had inherited it jointly with her brothers, and spent the morning going through his private study. Winston had been meticulous about record-keeping. His desk drawers contained detailed files on every major decision he had made over the past decade, along with handwritten notes about problems he had identified within the company. What I found there was both enlightening and disturbing. According to Winston's private notes, Velrowe Pharmaceuticals was facing several critical challenges that Blake and Trevor had either ignored or actively made worse. The company's research and development department was hemorrhaging money on projects that had little chance of success, largely because Trevor kept pushing resources toward high-profile initiatives that would generate positive media coverage, rather than focusing on drugs that might actually help patients. Blake, meanwhile, had been cutting operational costs in ways that improved short-term profits but created long-term risks. He had reduced quality control staff, delayed equipment maintenance, and negotiated supplier contracts that prioritized low prices over reliable delivery schedules. Winston's notes suggested that the company was one manufacturing failure away from a crisis that could destroy decades of reputation building. But the most shocking discovery was a folder labeled Succession Planning that contained detailed psychological profiles of Blake and Trevor, written by Winston himself. Reading his assessment of his own sons was like watching a man slowly realize that the people he loved most in the world were fundamentally unsuited to carry on his legacy. Humbly, Blake possesses strong analytical skills and genuine dedication to the company's financial success, Winston had written. However, he views employees as costs to be minimized rather than assets to be developed. His leadership style creates compliance but not commitment, and he seems incapable of inspiring the kind of innovation that will be necessary for long-term survival in this industry. The assessment of Trevor was even more damning. Trevor has exceptional sales skills and understands market dynamics better than most executives twice his age. Unfortunately, he is primarily motivated by personal recognition and has little interest in the unglamorous work of actually developing superior products. He would rather spend resources on marketing campaigns that make him look successful than on research that might take years to pay off. Winston's conclusion was stark. Neither of my sons possesses the combination of technical understanding, ethical judgment, and long-term perspective necessary to lead this company into the next generation. They see Velrowe Pharmaceuticals as their inheritance rather than their responsibility. That afternoon, I arranged a private meeting with Dr. Sarah Chen, the head of research and development. She had been with the company for 12 years and had a reputation for both scientific brilliance and brutal honesty. If anyone could give me an unfiltered assessment of the company's real situation, it would be her. We met at a coffee shop in Southeast Portland, far from the corporate headquarters where Blake and Trevor might spot us together. Dr. Chen was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and the intense focus of someone who spent her days solving complex problems. "I heard about the will reading," she said without preamble. "The whole company is buzzing about it. Most people are either shocked or terrified." "What about you?" I asked. She smiled grimly, relieved. Winston was a visionary, but his sons have been slowly destroying everything he built. Blake treats our department like a cost center to be squeezed, and Trevor keeps pushing us to develop drugs that will generate headlines rather than help patients. Over the next hour, Dr. Chen painted a detailed picture of a company in decline. Several promising research projects had been canceled because they wouldn't produce immediate profits. The quality control department had identified problems with 3 different production lines, but Blake had delayed addressing them because the fixes would impact quarterly earnings. Most troubling, 2 senior researchers had already accepted positions with competitors, citing frustration with the company's shifting priorities. "The question," Dr. Chen said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, "is whether you're going to be different. You own the company now, but do you understand what it takes to actually run it? It was a fair question, and I gave her an honest answer. I don't know yet, but I'm willing to learn, and I'm not afraid to admit when I need help. That evening, I had dinner with Corinna at our apartment in the Pearl District. She had been unusually quiet since the will reading, and I could see the conflict playing out behind her eyes. She loved me, but she also loved her brothers, and Winston's decision had put her in an impossible position. "They're furious," she said finally, picking at her salad without really eating. "Blake spent an hour on the phone with 3 different lawyers, trying to find a way to contest the will. Trevor keeps saying Dad was manipulated or coerced somehow." "And what do you think?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "I think Dad knew exactly what he was doing. He watched you for 7 years, Kaelen. He saw how you treated people, how you approached problems, how you never tried to take credit for things you didn't do. He saw something in you that his own sons never showed him." The next morning, I walked into Velrowe Pharmaceuticals as the owner rather than an employee. The receptionist looked confused when I asked to be shown to Winston's office, now my office, and I could see whispered conversations starting throughout the lobby as word spread that I was actually going to try to run the company. Blake and Trevor were waiting for me when I arrived on the executive floor. They had clearly spent the night strategizing, because their approach was more subtle than I had expected. "Kaelen," Blake said, his voice carefully controlled, "we've been talking, and we want to help make this transition as smooth as possible. Obviously, Dad's decision came as a shock to everyone, but we're family, and family sticks together." Trevor nodded agreement. "The company is facing some complex challenges right now. Regulatory issues, supply chain problems, investor relations. These are areas where you're going to need experienced guidance." It was a reasonable offer, wrapped in condescension. They were positioning themselves as indispensable advisors while making it clear that they considered me incompetent to handle a job alone. The subtext was obvious: accept their help and let them continue running things as they always had, or fail spectacularly and prove that Winston had made a terrible mistake. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully. "Let's schedule a meeting for this afternoon to discuss the company's current situation in detail. I want to understand everything: the financial picture, ongoing projects, regulatory issues, personnel challenges, everything." Blake and Trevor exchanged a glance that I wasn't supposed to notice. They thought they had won, that I was acknowledging my dependence on their expertise. But what they didn't know was that I had spent the previous day not just reading Winston's files, but also accessing the company's computer systems with the administrative privileges that came with my new position. I had pulled financial reports, project timelines, email communications, and personnel records. I knew about the quality control problems Blake had been hiding, the research projects Trevor had killed, and the employee complaints that had been ignored or suppressed. The meeting that afternoon was going to be very interesting indeed. The boardroom felt different when I walked in that afternoon. The same mahogany table, the same leather chairs, the same view of downtown Portland through floor-to-ceiling windows. But now I was sitting in Winston's chair, and Blake and Trevor were sitting across from me like supplicants requesting an audience. They had prepared extensively. Trevor carried a thick portfolio of charts and graphs, while Blake had printed copies of financial reports and strategic planning documents. They clearly intended to overwhelm me with information and complexity, demonstrating their indispensable expertise while highlighting my inexperience. "Let's start with the current financial picture," Blake said, spreading spreadsheets across the table. "Revenue is up 8% year over year, but we're facing margin pressure from increased raw material costs. The board has been discussing several cost reduction initiatives that will need immediate attention." I nodded and made notes, letting them present their carefully rehearsed overview of the company's challenges and opportunities. Trevor followed with a presentation about market conditions, competitor analysis, and pending regulatory approvals for 3 new drugs in the development pipeline. They were impressive, I had to admit. Both men clearly understood the business at a level of detail that would have taken me months to acquire through independent study. Their analysis was thorough, their recommendations seemed reasonable, and their presentation was polished enough for a Fortune 500 board meeting. The problem was that almost everything they told me was either incomplete or deliberately misleading. When Blake finished explaining the margin pressure from increased raw material costs, I pulled out a printed email exchange I had found in the company's archived communications. "This is interesting," I said, sliding the pages across the table. "According to this correspondence with our primary supplier, The cost increases you're referring to were the result of a contract renegotiation that you initiated to secure bulk pricing discounts. The supplier warned that delivery delays and quality issues might result from the new terms, but you approved the changes anyway. Blake's confident expression faltered slightly. That's taken out of context. The overall savings significantly outweigh the minor operational adjustments. Minor operational adjustments, I repeated. Is that what we're calling the quality control problems that Dr. Chen reported to you 6 weeks ago? The ones that required us to halt production on 2 separate lines while we investigated contamination issues? Trevor jumped in, trying to redirect the conversation. Every pharmaceutical company deals with quality control challenges. It's part of the business. The important thing is that we address problems quickly and maintain our safety standards. I opened another folder. Speaking of safety standards, I've been reviewing the research and development budget. Can you explain why funding was cut for the Phase 3 trials on the arthritis medication that showed such promising results in earlier testing? Trevor's polished demeanor cracked visibly. That project had significant cost overruns and an uncertain timeline for FDA approval. We had to make difficult resource allocation decisions. According to Dr. Chen's reports, the Phase 3 trials were on schedule and within budget. The real reason for the cancellation appears to be that the drug wouldn't generate enough media attention to justify the marketing investment you wanted to make. I slid another document across the table. This is your email to the marketing department, dated 3 weeks ago, where you specifically state that the arthritis drug is too boring for our brand positioning goals. The silence that followed was profound. Blake and Trevor were beginning to realize that their new boss wasn't the clueless outsider they had expected. I had done my homework, and I had access to information they didn't know I possessed. But I wasn't finished. Let's talk about personnel issues, I continued, opening a third folder. I've been reviewing exit interview reports for the past year. 15 employees have left the company, including some very senior people. The common theme in their feedback is concerns about leadership direction and ethical standards. Blake recovered first, falling back on corporate speak. Employee turnover is unfortunately common in our industry. We conduct thorough exit interviews and take all feedback seriously. Do you? I asked. Because I found a very interesting email thread between the two of you discussing how to manage the messaging around Dr. Rodriguez's departure. He was the lead researcher on 3 major projects, and his exit interview cited fundamental disagreements with management priorities as his reason for leaving. I pulled out a printed email and read directly from it. This is from your correspondence, Trevor. We need to control the narrative around Rodriguez. If word gets out that he left because he disagreed with our research priorities, it could impact investor confidence. Let's focus on the personal family reasons angle. Trevor's face flushed red. That's completely taken out of context. We were simply trying to protect the company's reputation during a difficult transition. By lying about why a respected scientist left the company. By managing communications professionally, Blake interjected, this is exactly the kind of nuanced leadership challenge that requires experience to handle properly. I closed the folders and leaned back in Winston's chair. Here's what I think happened. You've both been so focused on managing quarterly profits and maintaining your own positions that you've lost sight of what actually makes this company successful. You've cut corners on quality control, canceled promising research projects, and driven away talented employees, all while convincing yourselves that you are making tough but necessary business decisions. Blake stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. You've been looking through emails and reports for 2 days, and now you think you understand a business that took Dad 40 years to build? You're going to destroy everything he worked for. Actually, I said calmly, I think Winston understood exactly what was happening. That's why he made the decision he did. I pulled out Winston's private succession planning notes and began reading directly from his assessment of both brothers. Their faces went white as I recited their father's carefully documented concerns about their leadership styles, their treatment of employees, and their long-term vision for the company. When I finished reading, Trevor was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Dad wrote that about us? He loved you both, I said quietly, but he loved this company too, and he understood that sometimes love requires making difficult decisions. Blake's voice was barely controlled. So what happens now? You fire us and try to run everything yourself? No, I said. You're both talented executives with valuable skills. But things are going to be different. Blake, you're going to work with Dr. Chen to address every single quality control issue, even if it impacts short-term profits. Trevor, you're going to restart funding for the arthritis drug trials and focus our marketing efforts on products that actually help patients rather than generate headlines. And if we refuse? Trevor asked. I opened one final folder. Then you'll be looking for new jobs. I had Harold Fitzgerald prepare employment agreements for both of you. You can sign them and continue working here under my leadership, or you can decline, and I'll begin the search for your replacements tomorrow morning. The contracts were fair but firm. Both men would retain their executive positions and current salaries, but their decision-making authority would be significantly reduced. All major initiatives would require my approval, and their performance would be evaluated based on patient outcomes and employee satisfaction rather than just financial metrics. Blake read through his contract slowly, his jaw muscles working as he processed the terms. Trevor scanned his more quickly, then threw it down on the table. This is humiliating, Trevor said. You're treating us like junior executives who need supervision. I'm treating you like employees who need to earn back the trust they've lost, I replied. Blake finally looked up from his contract. What if we do sign? What guarantee do we have that you won't just fire us anyway once you feel more confident about running things yourself? It was a fair question, and I gave him an honest answer. None. Your job security will depend on your performance and your commitment to the values this company was founded on, just like everyone else who works here. Trevor stood up and headed for the door. I need time to think about this. Blake remained seated, still staring at the contract. Dad really believed you could do this job? He thought I could learn to do it, I said. The question is whether you're willing to help me succeed or watch me fail. Blake was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up a pen and signed the contract. I'll help, he said quietly. But if you screw this up, you'll destroy everything Dad built. I hope you understand that. As he left the boardroom, I sat alone in Winston's chair, looking out at the Portland skyline and wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life or taken the first step toward proving that Winston's faith in me had been justified. Either way, there was no going back now. The war began at 6:47 the next morning with a phone call from Harold Fitzgerald. His usually calm voice carried an edge of concern that made my stomach tighten before he even explained why he was calling. Kaelen, we have a problem. Trevor filed an injunction yesterday evening, claiming that Winston was mentally incompetent when he executed the will. He's requesting a full psychiatric evaluation of your father-in-law posthumously and asking the court to freeze all company assets until the matter is resolved. I sat up in bed, Corinna stirring beside me as my voice sharpened. Can he do that? Unfortunately, yes. Oregon law allows family members to contest a will on the grounds of mental incapacity, even after death. Trevor has hired Morrison, Blackwell & Associates. They're aggressive, expensive, and they specialize in exactly this type of case. Morrison, Blackwell & Associates, I knew that name. They had represented several high-profile families in inheritance disputes over the years, and their success rate was intimidating. Trevor wasn't just angry, he was going nuclear. By 8:30 a.m., I was in Fitzgerald's office, reviewing the injunction paperwork. The legal language was dense and technical, but the intent was crystal clear. Trevor was arguing that Winston had been suffering from early-stage dementia or some other cognitive impairment that rendered him incapable of making sound decisions about his business empire. If successful, the challenge could invalidate the entire will and revert control of the company back to Winston's sons. How strong is his case? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Fitzgerald removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as his way of buying time before delivering bad news. It's not frivolous. Winston was 73, he had been experiencing some health issues, and the decision to leave controlling interest to a non-family member was unusual enough to raise questions. Trevor's lawyers will argue that Winston was manipulated or coerced, possibly by you. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Harold, you know that's not true. I never asked Winston for anything. I didn't even know about the will until it was read. I believe you completely, Fitzgerald replied, but belief and legal proof are two different things. We'll need to demonstrate that Winston was of sound mind, and that his decision was made freely, without undue influence. That means gathering medical records, testimony from people who interacted with him regularly, and evidence that he understood the full implications of his choices. I spent the rest of the morning calling Winston's doctors, his banker, his golf partners, and anyone else who had regular contact with him during his final months. The picture that emerged was consistent. Winston had been sharp, engaged, and fully in control of his faculties right up until his death. His cardiologist confirmed that while Winston had heart problems, there were no signs of cognitive decline or mental impairment. But Trevor's legal challenge was only the beginning of my problems. The news of the inheritance dispute leaked to the Portland Business Journal by noon, and by 2 p.m., the story had been picked up by 3 other business publications. The headlines were uniformly damaging. Velrowe Pharmaceutical's ownership in question, family feud threatens Portland pharma giant, and the particularly brutal IT workers' inheritance sparks legal battle. The phone in my office began ringing constantly. Investors wanted reassurance about the company's stability. Suppliers demanded guarantees that their contracts would be honored. The head of our regulatory affairs department warned me that the FDA might delay approval of our pending drug applications if they perceived the company to be in management crisis. Dr. Chen appeared in my doorway at 3:15, her expression grim. "We need to talk, privately." We walked to the coffee shop where we had met earlier in the week, but this time the atmosphere was far from collegial. Dr. Chen slid a printed email across the table with the subject line, "Confidential, Research Direction Concerns." Trevor sent this to 6 department heads yesterday evening, including 3 people on our board of directors, she said. "He's questioning your qualifications to make decisions about research priorities and suggesting that the company's scientific credibility is at risk under your leadership." I read the email carefully. Trevor had been clever, avoiding direct accusations while raising subtle concerns about my technical background and industry experience. He questioned whether someone with primarily IT expertise could properly evaluate pharmaceutical research, and he worried aloud about the company's ability to maintain its reputation for scientific excellence during a period of management uncertainty. "How are people responding?" I asked. "Mixed reactions. Some of the senior staff are concerned about stability and wondering if they should start looking for other positions. Others are taking a wait-and-see approach. But Trevor's message is definitely resonating with people who were already skeptical about Winston's decision." That evening, I called an emergency meeting of the company's board of directors. 8 people sat around the conference table, and I could see the concern in their faces as I outlined the legal challenge in the media coverage. These were successful executives and investors who had worked with Winston for years, and they were clearly worried about the potential impact on their own investments. Margaret Swanson, who had served on the board for over a decade, spoke first. "Kaelen, we all respected Winston's judgment. But this situation is creating significant uncertainty for our stakeholders. The stock price has already dropped 12% since news of the legal challenge broke." Richard Hawthorne, representing our largest institutional investor, leaned forward. "I need to be direct. Our fund has $47 million invested in this company. If this inheritance dispute continues, we may need to consider reducing our position to protect our portfolio." I had prepared for this conversation, but hearing the potential consequences laid out so starkly was still sobering. "I understand your concerns, and I want to address them directly. First, Harold Fitzgerald is confident that Trevor's legal challenge will fail. Winston left extensive documentation of his decision-making process, and we have medical records proving he was mentally competent." "But even if you win the legal battle," Margaret interjected, "the management transition is still a major risk factor. You've never run a company of this size or complexity." She was right, and I couldn't deny it. But I had spent the past week developing a plan that I hoped would address exactly those concerns. "You're absolutely correct," I said. "That's why I'm proposing a 6-month transition period where I'll work closely with an experienced pharmaceutical executive who will serve as my advisor and help ensure continuity in our operations." I pulled out a folder and distributed copies of a detailed transition plan I had been working on since the will reading. The plan called for bringing in Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the former CEO of Northwest Biologics, as a consulting advisor. Dr. Morrison had 30 years of experience in pharmaceutical management and had successfully guided 2 companies through major transitions. "Dr. Morrison has agreed to work with us for 6 months," I continued. "She'll provide strategic guidance, help me learn the aspects of the business where I need development, and serve as a bridge between the old leadership structure and the new one." The board members passed Dr. Morrison's resume around the table, and I could see some of the tension leave their faces as they read her credentials. But Richard wasn't satisfied yet. What about Trevor's concerns regarding research priorities? He's suggesting that you might not have the scientific background to make informed decisions about which projects to fund. I had anticipated this question as well. Trevor is correct that I don't have a PhD in biochemistry or pharmaceutical science. But I do have something that's been missing from research decisions for the past few years. Objectivity. I don't have personal relationships with specific research teams or emotional attachments to particular projects. My decisions will be based solely on scientific merit and patient benefit. To prove the point, I distributed a preliminary analysis I had conducted of the company's current research portfolio. Working with Dr. Chen, I had identified 3 projects that were consuming significant resources despite showing minimal promise in early trials, while 2 other projects with stronger scientific foundations had been underfunded. For example, I said, pointing to the analysis, we're currently spending $2.8 million annually on a cholesterol medication that has shown only marginal improvement over existing treatments in 2 separate phase 2 trials. Meanwhile, our Alzheimer's research project, which has demonstrated genuinely promising results, is operating on a budget that's 40% smaller. Margaret studied the numbers carefully. This is exactly the kind of resource allocation problem that Winston was concerned about in his final months. He mentioned to me several times that he felt research priorities were being driven by factors other than scientific merit. The meeting continued for another hour, with each board member raising concerns and asking detailed questions about my transition plan. By the end, I had secured tentative approval for my approach, conditional on Dr. Morrison accepting the advisory role and the successful resolution of Trevor's legal challenge. But as the board members filed out, Margaret lingered behind. "Kaelen, I want you to know that I'm rooting for you to succeed. Winston was a dear friend, and I trust his judgment, but you need to understand that Trevor isn't going to give up easily. He's already been making phone calls to investors, suppliers, and even some of our customers, raising questions about the company's stability." Her warning proved prophetic. Over the next 3 days, I fielded increasingly uncomfortable conversations with business partners who had been contacted by Trevor. He wasn't making direct accusations, but he was skillfully planting seeds of doubt about my competence and the company's future direction. The most damaging incident came on Thursday morning, when our largest customer, Pacific Northwest Medical Group, called to express concerns about a delayed shipment of antibiotics. The delay was actually the result of the quality control issues that Blake had been hiding, but Trevor had somehow convinced the customer that it was related to management instability caused by the ownership dispute. "We've been buying from Velrowe for 15 years, explained Dr. James Patterson, the medical group's purchasing director. "But we can't afford supply chain disruptions. If there's any chance that your current situation might impact future deliveries, we need to start developing relationships with alternative suppliers." Losing Pacific Northwest Medical Group would cost us nearly $8 million in annual revenue. More importantly, it would signal to other customers that our business partnerships were at risk, potentially creating a cascade of contract cancellations that could cripple the company. I knew I had to act decisively. That afternoon, I called a meeting with Blake, Dr. Chen, and the heads of our quality control, manufacturing, and customer service departments. It was time to address the operational problems that Trevor was exploiting to undermine my credibility. "We're going to fix every single quality control issue in the next 2 weeks," I announced. "I don't care if it impacts our quarterly profits. I want our production lines operating at 100% reliability, and I want documentation proving it." Blake looked uncomfortable. "Kaelen, some of those fixes will require significant capital investment. If we spend that money now, it will definitely hurt our third-quarter earnings report." "Then we'll explain to our shareholders why we made that investment," I replied. "Winston didn't build this company by cutting corners on quality, and neither will I." Dr. Chen smiled for the first time in days. Finally, someone who understands that our reputation is worth more than a single quarter's profits. Over the weekend, I worked 18-hour days reviewing every aspect of our operations, identifying problems, and developing solutions. By Monday morning, I had a comprehensive plan that addressed not just the quality control issues, but also the research funding disparities, the employee retention problems, and the customer service gaps that had been developing over the past year. The question was whether I could implement these changes fast enough to prove that Winston's faith in me had been justified, or whether Trevor's campaign of doubt and disruption would succeed in destroying everything before I had a chance to demonstrate my competence. As I prepared for another week of battles on multiple fronts, I remembered something Winston had told me during one of our long conversations. The pharmaceutical business isn't just about making money, Kaelen. It's about earning the trust of people who are literally betting their lives on the quality of your products. Now I understood exactly what he meant, and why he had been willing to risk everything on someone he believed would remember that principle when others forgot it. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when Judge Patricia Reynolds called the case of Velrowe versus Stravick to order on Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. 3 rows of reporters filled the gallery, along with employees, investors, and family friends who had come to witness what the Portland Tribune was calling the most significant inheritance dispute in Oregon's recent history. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Harold Fitzgerald, watching Trevor and his legal team arrange their presentation materials with the confidence of people who believed they were about to win a decisive victory. Morrison, Blackwell, and Associates had brought 4 attorneys, 2 paralegals, and enough documentation to stock a small library. They clearly intended to overwhelm the court with evidence of Winston's alleged mental decline and my supposed manipulation of a vulnerable old man. Blake sat in the gallery behind Trevor, his expression unreadable. Corinna was beside me, her hands squeezing mine with enough force to cut off circulation. Dr. Chen had positioned herself where I could see her encouraging nod, and Margaret Swanson from the board of directors was 3 rows back, flanked by 2 other board members who had come to observe the proceedings. Judge Reynolds was a stern woman in her 60s, with silver hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she had little patience for legal theatrics. She had been on the bench for over 20 years and had a reputation for cutting through complex cases to focus on the essential facts. "Mr. Morrison," she said, addressing Trevor's lead attorney, "you may present your opening statement." James Morrison rose with theatrical precision. He was exactly the kind of lawyer you would cast in a movie about inheritance disputes. Expensive suit, silver hair, and the kind of voice that commanded attention, even when saying nothing particularly important. "Your Honor," Morrison began, "this case represents a tragic example of an elderly man being manipulated during a period of declining mental capacity. Winston Velrowe was a brilliant businessman who built one of Oregon's most successful pharmaceutical companies over 4 decades. But in his final months, he made decisions that were so completely contrary to his character and judgment that they can only be explained by either mental impairment or undue influence." Morrison walked to an easel, displaying a timeline of Winston's final year. "The evidence will show that Mr. Velrowe's behavior became increasingly erratic after his heart attack in March. He made impulsive decisions about business operations, changed long-standing policies without consultation, and began expressing paranoid concerns about his own sons, competence, and loyalty." I felt my stomach tighten as Morrison outlined his case. He painted a picture of Winston as a confused old man, easily manipulated by a scheming son-in-law who had spent years positioning himself for exactly this opportunity. According to Morrison's narrative, I had systematically undermined Blake and Trevor's relationship with their father while presenting myself as the loyal, trustworthy alternative. "Most telling," Morrison continued, "is the timing of this alleged will. Mr. Velrowe executed this document just 6 months before his death, during a period when his cardiologist had prescribed medications that are known to affect cognitive function. The defendant had unprecedented access to Mr. Velrowe during this time, often visiting him alone at his residence when family members were not present. Morrison's presentation was masterful in its implications without direct accusations. He suggested that I had isolated Winston from his sons, fed him false information about their performance, and convinced him to make decisions that served my interests rather than his own." When Morrison finished, Judge Reynolds turned to Harold Fitzgerald. "Mr. Fitzgerald, your response?" Harold stood slowly, and I could see the decades of courtroom experience in his measured movements. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's case rests on speculation, innuendo, and a fundamental misunderstanding of Winston Velrowe's character. The evidence will show that Mr. Velrowe was not only mentally competent when he executed his final will, but that his decision was the result of careful observation and deliberate planning that extended back several years." Harold walked to his own easel and displayed a different timeline, one that showed Winston's business decisions and personal interactions over the past 3 years, rather than just his final months. "Winston Velrowe was indeed concerned about the future of his company," Harold continued. "But those concerns were not the product of paranoia or cognitive decline. They were the result of documented problems with quality control, employee retention, and research priorities that had been developing under his son's leadership. Harold presented Winston's private files, which I had discovered in his study. The medical records showed no signs of cognitive impairment. The business documents demonstrated a pattern of careful analysis and strategic thinking that continued right up until Winston's death. Most importantly, Harold had obtained testimony from Dr. Patricia Adams, Winston's cardiologist, who would swear that Winston's medications had no significant impact on his mental faculties. But the real turning point came when Harold called his first witness, Dr. Robert Chen, a neuropsychologist who had evaluated Winston just 4 months before his death as part of a routine cognitive assessment that Winston had requested himself. "Dr. Chen," Harold said, "please describe the results of your evaluation of Mr. Velrowe." Dr. Chen was a small, precise man who spoke with the authority of someone who had spent 30 years evaluating cognitive function. "I administered a comprehensive battery of tests designed to assess memory, reasoning ability, judgment, and decision-making capacity. Mr. Velrowe's scores were well within normal ranges for a man his age, and in several areas they were significantly above average." Morrison jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This evaluation was conducted months before the will was executed." "Overruled," Judge Reynolds replied. "The witness may continue." Dr. Chen continued his testimony, explaining that Winston had specifically requested the evaluation because he wanted to ensure that he was mentally competent to make important decisions about his business succession. The evaluation included not just cognitive tests, but also detailed interviews about Winston's understanding of his business, his family relationships, and his long-term planning objectives. "Based on your evaluation," Harold asked, "was Mr. Velrowe capable of making informed decisions about the distribution of his assets?" "Absolutely," Dr. Chen replied without hesitation. "Mr. Velrowe demonstrated clear understanding of his business operations, realistic assessment of various family members, strengths and weaknesses, and sound reasoning about long-term strategic challenges. His decision-making process was methodical, well-reasoned, and entirely consistent with mental competency." Morrison's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. Dr. Chen's credentials were impeccable, his methodology was sound, and his conclusions were supported by detailed documentation. The next witness was even more damaging to Trevor's case. Harold called Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, Winston's housekeeper for over 15 years, who had been present during many of the private conversations between Winston and various family members. "Mrs. Patterson," Harold said, "during Mr. Velrowe's final months, did you observe any signs of confusion or mental impairment?" "No, sir," she replied in a clear, strong voice. "Mr. Winston was sharp as ever right up to the end. He read the financial papers every morning, worked on his crossword puzzles, and could remember details about conversations from weeks earlier." "Did you observe any inappropriate influence being exerted by Mr. Stravick?" Mrs. Patterson looked directly at me, then back at the judge. "Mr. Kaelen never asked Mr. Winston for anything, never pressured him about business decisions. If anything, he tried to stay out of family business discussions. Mr. Winston was the one who always brought up company matters during their visits." Harold's final witness was the most devastating of all, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the pharmaceutical executive I had hired as my advisor, who had worked with Winston on several industry initiatives over the years. "Dr. Morrison," Harold said, "based on your professional interactions with Mr. Velrowe, what was your assessment of his mental acuity during his final year?" "Winston was one of the sharpest executives I've ever worked with," she replied. "Even in his 70s, he had an uncanny ability to see patterns and problems that others missed. His concerns about succession planning weren't the result of declining judgment. They were the product of superior judgment applied to a complex family and business situation." Dr. Morrison went on to describe conversations she'd had with Winston about his son's management styles, conversations that closely paralleled the private assessments I had found in his files. Winston had been systematically documenting problems with Blake and Trevor's leadership for over 2 years, gathering evidence to support what he knew would be a controversial decision. But the real bombshell came when Harold introduced Winston's personal video testimony. "Your Honor," Harold announced, 6 months before his death, Mr. Velrowe created a video recording explaining his succession decision. He specifically requested that this recording be used in the event that his judgment was questioned." The courtroom fell silent as a large monitor was wheeled into position. Winston's face appeared on screen, looking directly into the camera with the same intense focus I remembered from our conversations. "If this recording is being played," Winston said, his voice clear and strong, "it means that someone is questioning my mental competence or suggesting that I was manipulated into making decisions about my estate. Let me be absolutely clear. I am of sound mind. I understand the full implications of my decisions, and I am acting entirely of my own free will." The recording continued for nearly 20 minutes. Winston methodically explained his concerns about Blake and Trevor's leadership, his assessment of my character and capabilities, and his rationale for transferring control of the company to someone outside the immediate family. He anticipated every argument that might be raised against his decision and addressed them with the kind of detailed analysis that only a sharp, focused mind could produce. "I love my sons," Winston said near the end of the recording, "but love does not require me to ignore their limitations or enable their mistakes. Kaelen Stravick has shown me qualities that I hoped to see in Blake and Trevor, but never did: humility, respect for others, and a genuine commitment to the principles this company was founded on. I trust him to preserve what I built while having the courage to change what needs changing." When the recording ended, the courtroom was completely silent. Trevor's face had gone pale, and even Morrison looked shaken. Judge Reynolds stared at the blank screen for several seconds before turning to Morrison. "Mr. Morrison, do you wish to cross-examine this witness?" It was a moment of dark humor in an otherwise tense proceeding. How do you cross-examine a dead man who had anticipated your arguments and methodically dismantled them? Morrison rose slowly. "No questions, Your Honor." Harold's closing argument was brief and devastating. He summarized the medical evidence, the witness testimony, and Winston's own words, building an overwhelming case that the will represented the considered judgment of a competent man who understood exactly what he was doing. Morrison's closing was longer but less effective. He argued that even competent people could be manipulated, that the video could have been coerced, and that Winston's decision was so contrary to normal family expectations that it suggested undue influence regardless of the evidence. Judge Reynolds retired for less than an hour before returning with her decision. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony," she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality, "this court finds that Winston Velrowe was mentally competent at the time he executed his final will and testament. There is no credible evidence of undue influence, coercion, or manipulation. The will stands as written, and all assets are to be distributed according to Mr. Velrowe's clearly expressed wishes." Trevor's shoulders sagged as if he had been physically struck. Blake stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "Corinna squeezed my hand so hard I thought she might break bones." But Judge Reynolds wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, "this court finds that the challenge to this will was frivolous and without merit. The plaintiff clearly hoped to use the legal process to pressure a settlement or create enough uncertainty to achieve through litigation what he could not achieve through legitimate means. Such abuse of the court system cannot be tolerated." She turned to look directly at Trevor. "Mr. Velrowe, you are hereby ordered to pay all court costs and reasonable attorney fees incurred by the defendant in responding to your baseless challenge. This case is closed." As we left the courthouse, reporters surrounded us with questions and cameras, but I felt strangely calm as I stood on the steps where Winston had once announced the opening of his first major research facility. "Mr. Stravick," called a reporter from the Portland Tribune, "what's your response to this victory?" I looked out at the crowd of media, employees, and investors who had gathered to witness this moment. "This was never about victory or defeat," I said. "This was about honoring the wishes of a man who spent 40 years building something important. Winston Velrowe trusted me with his life's work, and I intend to prove that his trust was well placed." As the crowd dispersed and the camera stopped rolling, I felt the full weight of what had just happened settle on my shoulders. The legal battle was over, but the real work was just beginning. I was no longer just the despised son-in-law who had inherited a company. I was now, indisputably and permanently, the person responsible for ensuring that Winston's legacy would survive and thrive. The question was whether I was ready for what came next. 6 months after the court victory, I stood in the same boardroom where Blake and Trevor had once treated me like an unwelcome intruder, but everything had changed. The mahogany table was the same, the view of downtown Portland was identical, but the energy in the room was completely different. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison sat to my right, her 6-month advisory contract having evolved into a permanent position as Chief Operating Officer. Dr. Chen was presenting quarterly research results that showed remarkable progress across multiple projects. The arthritis medication that Trevor had canceled was now in Phase 3 trials with promising preliminary data, and 2 other research initiatives that had been underfunded were showing breakthrough potential. Most significantly, Blake sat at the far end of the table, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions about resource allocation. The man who had once dismissed my technical expertise now regularly sought my input on strategic decisions, and his earlier arrogance had been replaced by something I never thought I would see from him: humility. Trevor was notably absent. 3 weeks after the court defeat, he had submitted his resignation and moved to Seattle to join a biotech startup. His departure had been awkward, but necessary. Unlike Blake, who had eventually accepted the new reality and committed to making it work, Trevor never recovered from the public humiliation of losing the inheritance challenge. He had tried to undermine my authority through passive resistance and continued attempts to poison relationships with key stakeholders. The final straw came when I discovered that Trevor had been secretly negotiating with a competitor to share proprietary research data in exchange for a senior position with their company. Harold Fitzgerald's investigation revealed a paper trail of emails and meetings that constituted clear corporate espionage. Rather than face criminal charges, Trevor had quietly resigned and signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that prevented him from working in the pharmaceutical industry for 3 years. "The third quarter numbers are exceptional," Dr. Morrison was saying, pulling my attention back to the present meeting. "Revenue is up 18% year over year, and more importantly, our employee satisfaction scores have improved dramatically across all departments." Margaret Swanson, who had remained on the board despite her initial skepticism, nodded approvingly. "The turnaround has been remarkable. When we implemented the quality control improvements 6 months ago, I was concerned about the impact on short-term profitability, but the increased customer confidence has more than offset the additional costs." It was true. The decision to prioritize quality over quarterly profits had initially been expensive and disruptive. We had shut down 2 production lines for extensive upgrades, invested heavily in new testing equipment, and hired additional quality control staff. The third quarter financial results had been disappointing as a result, and several investors had expressed concern about my management priorities. But the long-term benefits were now undeniable. Pacific Northwest Medical Group, the major customer we had nearly lost during Trevor's sabotage campaign, had not only renewed their contract but expanded it to include 3 additional product lines. Word had spread throughout the medical community that Velrowe Pharmaceuticals was once again prioritizing quality and reliability over cost-cutting, and new customers were actively seeking us out. The employee retention numbers were even more impressive. In the year before Winston's death, the company had lost 15 senior employees, including several key researchers and managers. In the 6 months since I had taken control, only 2 people had left the company, both for promotions with non-competing organizations, and we had hired 12 new employees, including 3 experienced researchers who had been recruited away from larger pharmaceutical companies. "The culture change has been the most significant factor," explained Janet Rodriguez, our head of human resources. "Employees feel heard and valued in ways they haven't experienced in years." The anonymous feedback surveys showed dramatic improvements in management trust, job satisfaction, and long-term career optimism. Dr. Chen raised her hand. "I'd like to add something about the research environment. For the first time in 3 years, our scientists feel like they can pursue projects based on scientific merit rather than political considerations. The Alzheimer's research team is particularly excited about some breakthrough results they achieved last month." After the meeting ended, Blake approached me as the others filed out of the boardroom. Our relationship had evolved significantly over the past 6 months, though it remained somewhat formal and careful. The man who had once treated me with casual contempt now spoke to me with professional respect, but there was an underlying sadness in his interactions that suggested he was still processing the loss of the future he had expected to inherit. "Kaelen," he said, "I wanted to discuss the expansion proposal for our West Coast distribution network. I've been working with the logistics team on cost projections, and I think we have an opportunity to increase market penetration significantly." It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that Winston had always valued, and I could see glimpses of the executive Blake could become if he continued to focus on the company's long-term interests rather than his own ego. "That sounds promising," I replied. "Why don't you put together a comprehensive presentation for next week's board meeting?" Blake nodded, then hesitated as if he wanted to say something more personal. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "For years I treated you like you didn't belong here. I was wrong about your capabilities, and I was wrong about Dad's judgment. He saw something in you that I was too proud and too stupid to recognize." It was the first time Blake had directly acknowledged the way he and Trevor had treated me, and I could see the genuine remorse in his expression. "I appreciate that," I said, "but what matters now is moving forward together. This company is bigger than any of our personal issues." Blake extended his hand, and when I shook it, I could feel that something fundamental had shifted between us. We might never be close friends, but we had found a way to be effective colleagues working toward the same goals. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Winston was buried. It had become a monthly ritual, a quiet time for reflection and a way to maintain my connection to the man whose faith in me had changed everything. Winston's headstone was simple granite with his name, dates, and a single line. He built something that mattered. Corinna and I had chosen the inscription together, and it captured both his professional legacy and his personal values. I stood there in the gathering dusk, thinking about the journey from that first devastating will reading to this moment of quiet satisfaction. The scared, overwhelmed man who had inherited a company he didn't understand had evolved into someone who was not only running that company successfully, but transforming it into something Winston would be proud of. "The quarterly numbers look good," I said aloud, feeling somewhat foolish but continuing anyway. "Dr. Chen's team is making real progress on the Alzheimer's research, and we've got 3 new drug applications pending FDA approval. Blake is finally starting to understand what leadership actually means, and the employee surveys show that people are excited about working here again." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree that shaded Winston's grave, and I chose to interpret it as approval. "I'm still learning," I continued. "Dr. Morrison keeps me from making too many rookie mistakes, and I've got a lot to figure out about the regulatory environment and long-term strategic planning. But I think you were right about the foundation being more important than the fancy stuff on top." The foundation Winston had been referring to was trust. Trust between management and employees, trust between the company and its customers, trust between research scientists and the executive team that funded their work. That foundation had been eroding under Blake and Trevor's leadership, but it was slowly being rebuilt through consistent actions that prioritized long-term relationships over short-term profits. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed with a text message from Corinna. "Board dinner still on for tomorrow? Margaret wants to discuss the research facility expansion." The board dinner was another new tradition, an informal monthly gathering where directors, senior staff, and their spouses could discuss company matters in a relaxed setting. It was the kind of relationship building that Winston had always valued, and it helped create the collaborative atmosphere that had been missing during the final years of his life. I texted back, "Looking forward to it. Should I bring those cost projections Blake was working on?" Her response came immediately, "Bring them, but don't let work dominate the whole evening. These people want to get to know you as a person, not just as a CEO." It was good advice. One of the most important lessons I had learned over the past 6 months was that effective leadership required building genuine relationships, rather than simply issuing orders and expecting compliance. The employees, investors, and customers who had been skeptical of my qualifications were gradually becoming supporters as they saw consistent evidence of competent ethical decision-making. The next morning brought news that perfectly illustrated how much had changed since that first devastating boardroom confrontation. Dr. Chen knocked on my office door with an expression of barely contained excitement. "We just got the Phase 3 results for the arthritis medication," she said, holding a thick folder of test data. "Not only is it effective, but the side effect profile is significantly better than anything currently on the market. This could be a genuine breakthrough." The arthritis medication was the project Trevor had canceled for being, quote, "too boring for our brand positioning goals." If the FDA approved it based on these trial results, it would help millions of people manage chronic pain while generating substantial revenue that could fund even more ambitious research projects. "How long until we can file for FDA approval?" I asked. "With these results, we can submit the application within 6 weeks. Dr. Morrison thinks we have an excellent chance of fast-track approval, given the clear medical benefits and the safety profile." After Dr. Chen left, I sat back in Winston's chair and looked out at the Portland skyline. The city looked the same as it had 7 months earlier when I was just the invisible IT coordinator who fixed computers and stayed out of family business discussions. But everything else had changed. I was no longer the despised son-in-law who didn't belong in his wife's family's world of wealth and power. I was the CEO of a growing pharmaceutical company, leading a team of talented professionals who respected my judgment and trusted my leadership. Blake had evolved from antagonist to valuable colleague. Trevor's destructive influence had been eliminated. Most importantly, Winston's legacy was not only secure but thriving. The intercom buzzed, and my assistant announced that Pacific Northwest Medical Group was on the line with a question about expanding their contract to include our new antibiotic formulations. As I picked up the phone, I smiled at the thought of how different this conversation would be from the crisis call 6 months earlier when they were threatening to find alternative suppliers due to quality concerns. "This is Kaelen," I said. "How can we help you today?" Sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in dramatic moments of triumph, but in the quiet satisfaction of problems solved, relationships rebuilt, and trust earned through consistent action over time. Winston had been right about everything: the importance of treating people with respect, the value of long-term thinking, and the power of quiet competence over loud ambition. I had finally become the leader he always believed I could be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.